Hi everyone. Hope you are all having a wonderful evening. Thanks for joining us today for Mental Health Matters with Heather Benbrook. Each week we'll be discussing many of the aspects of mental health that play key roles in the lives of many of us, as we try to find our way on each of our unique Duchenne journeys. This week we will be discussing trauma, how it affects us and the constant role that it plays in the lives of those touched by the Duchenne diagnosis. Great to see you as always, Heather. Hope your week has been good.
It has been, thank you.
Heather, to begin our conversation today, could you please give an overall view of what trauma means?
Yeah, definitely. I have a resource that I've gone through some trainings with trauma before, and one of the biggest resources that we have for trauma is something called Star Commonwealth. And I found a quote on there that I think is really important to kind of start off with. And it says, trauma is real, but it does not seal an individual's fate. And so I thought that that was really, really powerful. One of the things that I noticed with trauma and with learning about trauma is that it affects people differently, but it can be so diverse and it really affects people's day-to-day life. One of the major things when you learn about trauma, there was a study done a while back. It was called the, they call it the ACEs study. Sorry, I can't remember the company's name, but it was a certain company, Kaiser Permanente, that's what it was. And they came up with some adverse childhood experiences. And those are the traumas that children typically experience. And so they broke those down into three categories. It's abuse, neglect, and then just general household dysfunction. And they studied this over time with this group of individuals. At the time, it was mostly males, mostly white males. So there is a little bit of data that's kind of skewed there. But overall, it's held a lot of permanence in psychology and in counseling and things like that as well. But when you're looking at these 10 adverse childhood experiences, or the ACEs, it puts it into perspective. Abuse can be physical, emotional, or sexual. Neglect is physical or emotional. And then the household dysfunction, it includes things like mental health of individuals in the household, incarcerated parents or individuals in the household. If the mother was treated or mistreated in the relationship, any kind of domestic abuse that was seen by children, drug abuse or substance abuse as well, and then divorce, which is, as we know in our society, is very, very common. And so when they looked at this, what they did, they studied these individuals that experienced these adverse childhood experiences. I'm just going to call them ACEs because it's so hard to get that out sometimes. When they studied this over a period of time, the more ACEs you have, the more health issues you have over time too. So I found it really interesting, though, that medical difficulties were not on that list. But I think, in my opinion, I think we could definitely add it to that, especially when it pertains, like when you're thinking about our community with Duchenne. And so having all of that and looking at those individual traumas, the more you experience these ACEs or these traumas over time, it really does affect your relationships. It affects your health. It affects your behavior, your overall well-being as a person. So that's kind of an overview of trauma, but it's just those things that happen to us. Sometimes they are big things and sometimes they're little things. And sometimes those little things add up to feel like they're really big things too. So We call those big T's and little T's, or big traumas and little traumas. So all of that tied together as a big picture, we are experiencing all of these things day in and day out. So just the more that it happens to us, the more it affects us, and it affects everything around us. So that's kind of a summary, I guess, of trauma, with a little bit more detail and some research that's been done about trauma as well.
Thanks so much, Heather. That really does help to understand what trauma truly is. Could you also speak about how trauma affects a person and how that can differ, depending on the individual?
Yeah, definitely. So, every individual is different on how they cope, right? We all have different coping skills. We all have different environments we are brought up in. The experiences that we learn from our parents or those that we're growing up with or live with as we grow up. So those childhood years are crucial to develop those learned behaviors or coping skills, or learning how to deal with the stressors of life and every day in and day out. A lot of times, if there's more poverty or there's some difficulties, medical difficulties, or grief or loss or different kinds of traumas that kind of accumulate, whether it's actual traumas that are happening to you or perceived traumas, you might not be directly impacted by. When I think about that, I think about COVID. We were all affected by COVID, right? But everybody kind of dealt with it in a different way. And the way I think about trauma and dealing with trauma, there's always been this vision, and it came to me kind of during the COVID times and COVID years as well. And there was some image that I saw, and it just has really stuck with me. We might all be in the same storm, but we don't all have the same boat. We don't all have the same capabilities. We don't all have, the yachts that we're trying to get through this storm in. Some of us have sailboats or little dinghies, and we have a little bit less to work with. It might be money or finances. It might be, lack of resources or lack of emotional regulation and lack of coping skills. But each one of our boats is a little bit different. And even though we might be going through a similar storm or similar circumstance, we all handle it a little bit differently because of the resources that we have, whether that's within us or things externally in our environment. So everyone, just like everyone is special and unique in this world, and we're all different, we all handle trauma differently as well.
Heather, could you please explain the differences between big trauma and little trauma, as well as the importance of not minimizing either one?
Definitely. Yeah. Big traumas are those things that we are experiencing or we perceive, right? Whether it's directly perceived or directly experienced in our life, or we perceive it as a big trauma, right? What is a big trauma to one person might not be a big trauma to another person, and vice versa. So when you're thinking about big traumas, those are like the big things that happen to you in life. It could be the loss of mobility when you're thinking about Duchenne. It could be that we have a loss or a death, and we're grieving as well, like we've talked about before. It could be that we're dealing with the abuse, like we're talked about with the ACEs, or a big divorce in your family, or moving could be a big trauma as well. So it's really more about how you perceive the trauma. But then when you think about the little T's, some of those little T's that can happen in life are day to day, like not being able to go out and be with friends. When you're thinking about the Duchenne community and your limitations, sometimes that do happen with Duchenne. Some of those things are isolating in a way, in a lot of ways. So when you think about like having to go to the doctors all the time, or being taking medications, things like that. It could be just feeling like you're alone or isolated, not having friends. So the little traumas that happen every single day, it's those things that kind of accumulate. And sometimes, like I said earlier, they can become those big traumas or be perceived as bigger traumas because they're so persistent, and they add up very quickly. I think of like snow, right? It's a little bitty snowflake, it's tiny little, minuscule snowflake. But when you have a lot of it and it keeps falling and it keeps falling and accumulates, and we can have a big snowball. And it just kind of keeps growing. But no matter whether it's a little trauma or a big trauma, it's trauma. And that is what gets to us, and it affects our everyday life. And so I don't want it to be minimized that these little traumas are little, right? Because they can end up being big or perceived as being big as well.
Heather, could you share with us a little more about how trauma appears in Duchenne and the constant role that it plays in the lives of those of us living with Duchenne, as well as the lives of our families?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I know I mentioned a couple of them earlier, but kind of focusing on certain areas. So like there's the medical traumas that are associated with Duchenne. That's that day-to-day medications that you might have to take. It's the going to clinical trials. It's having to get poked with a needle or having a port, those kinds of things. Tripping hazards, choking hazards, all the day-to-day things that might not have to be worried about with the general population. It's definitely different. It's a different experience. And those things can add up. They might be little T's, but overall, big picture, they can become a really big trauma or a hindrance in someone's life, especially dealing with Duchenne. Then I think about the social traumas, the social part of that. Isolation, not feeling like you have friends, or not feeling like you can do the things that your kind of general population friends might be able to do if you don't have that close knit of Duchenne friends. If children are in school, that feels very different. The school environment feels very different socially for the for children. I've had students before. I have had a student before who had Duchenne's, and he had to ride the elevator. He had to have somebody go with him because we had 2 stories. Just those day-to-day things that you don't really think about, or kids that might have less mobility restrictions. They don't have to think about those things. And so that can build up. That can be very socially isolating as well if you're not accommodating those students like they need to be. Then kind of leading into the school area too for individuals with Duchenne, there's elevators and things like that, but there's also like the school buses. The school buses are if you've ever been on a school bus or ever had to ride a school bus, and you already know, like, whether it's a regular school bus or it's one of our special education school buses, it's a stressful environment. And those bus drivers have their hands full for sure, poor things. And I commend them for the job that they do, because it takes a special person to do that and keep those kids safe. But a lot of times with our school buses, even our special ed school buses that have students with physical limitations on there, or that might need a little bit of extra help, sometimes they couple that in with students that might have behavior concerns. And it's a very stressful environment for all involved. And so there's that too. And so there's to me, there's like these layers and layers and layers. And I probably can go on and on and on about the different ones. But I think just the lack of understanding sometimes, and the that dependency that happens, and just the blaming and the guilt, all of these little traumas that are really can be perceived as big traumas over time, and they just add up. So if I had to kind of categorize some of those like main areas, it'd be like the medical areas that are special and unique to the Duchenne community, and the social aspects, and then especially with school, they're all tied together. So
Truly great points. Duchenne does really take quite a toll when it comes to trauma. As we wrap up today's conversation on trauma, Heather, could you please share some of the ways that we can help ourselves cope with the trauma that we experience in our lives?
yeah, definitely. I think with the traumas that we experience, that results in certain feelings and emotions that happen because the result of losing mobility or having to change their social standards and different things like that. All of these traumas can add up and really cause a lot of strong emotions. And so focusing on how to kind of just deal with those day-to-day aspects of trauma, and trying to notice when you are feeling a reaction to the trauma, and dealing with it using mindfulness, breathing strategies, talking to somebody about it, sharing those experiences with people that do understand, making connections in the Duchenne community, taking time to just have fun, and try to just be in that moment. So the list of coping skills could really go on and on and on too, but just like we've talked about with grief before, it's just finding those things that bring you joy and happiness, and trying to purposefully tie those into your daily life, because traumas are going to happen, and you just have to be purposeful.
Thanks so much, Heather. Great discussion. Well, I guess that will wrap up this week's Mental Health Matters. Great having you join us, Heather. You always offer such great guidance and a bit of hope to the Duchenne community. We do truly love having you. Thanks, everyone, for joining us this evening. We hope you found our discussion today helpful. If anyone would like to submit questions, or even join us for a discussion, please reach out to family, friends, and Duchenne. We look forward to hearing your thoughts. Have a great evening, and we hope you all enjoy your weekend. Join us next week for the next Mental Health Matters. Bye bye.